Wow, thank you so much. Does this sound all right? Does that work in back? Yeah. Okay, so what I want to talk about tonight is what it means to become a beginner again and again. I mean, I think that a lot of you out here are probably photographers, and for myself, even though I've reached a stage where I'm having a survey exhibition at a nice museum, I have to always remind myself how to become a beginner. And in part that means going back in my mind to when I started off as a photographer. And so I just want to quickly take you through that process. I actually started photography from the fine arts side of things. I did painting and sculpture. I always felt uncomfortable in a studio setting, so I was going out in the world making sculptures like this and earthworks. And I started documenting these things photographically, and that led me to photography. Then I discovered the work of Robert Adams, and he has a book, Summer Nights, and it's a very simple book. It's just Robert Adams wandering around in the evening. But this really lit a spark for me, and I was attracted to photography in part because I liked being alone and wandering alone, so I thought I would do this sort of thing. And basically in the beginning stages, I was just mimicking photographers that I liked, and so here I am wandering around at night, and then I encountered Robert Frank and his book, The Americans. This is his picture from his hotel window in Butte, Montana. And so when I was in college, I decided to make a road trip from where I lived in Minnesota down the Mississippi River as far as about Memphis, Tennessee. So this is a picture from that trip. This was me back then. I traveled with my girlfriend at the time, who was my wife all these years later. The thing about that trip at age, 20, is that these were the only pictures of people that were made on it, because I was terrified to photograph strangers. But I knew that I had to deal with this fear. And because I loved, Dion Arbus and this ability to photograph strangers. This is a picture made by Gary Winogrand of Dion Arbus photographing in a park. And so I thought to myself, well, okay, how can I teach myself how to photograph strangers? So I thought, well, first I'll go to the safest sort of public space I could go to, a park like this. Oh, I didn't know this slide was coming. This is, I'm just going to show this quickly. This is, of course, Ouija, the photographer. He's got, I have a little bit of audio of Ouija giving advice to young photographers. Let me play this.
There you have a camera. You make good pictures. Everybody likes them. But you have to get out of the class where you only photograph your friends and relatives indoors. That's very nice. But if you want to do it professionally, I don't see any reason why you shouldn't. Go out and photograph strangers. I know you're afraid to do it at first. I was scared stiff myself. But you have to do it. And most people like to be photographed. They consider it an honor to be picked out of a big crowd. In other words, you can't be a nice Nelly and do photography.
So I don't know if you catch that, but he says you can't be a nice Nelly and do photography. You have to be a little bolder and go out there. And so I started going out, and I go to parks and kind of approach the safest looking people that I could find. And then eventually, I expanded a little further. And the more I did this, it was like practice. I knew I wasn't making great art or anything, but I was practicing. And then over time, I started finding myself attracted to certain types of people. And this fellow carrying these suitcases, that was definitely one of them. And I didn't really understand this at the time, but in retrospect, it makes sense. Just scattering in a few favorite photographs. I showed that Diane Arbus earlier, which is an all-time favorite. This is the photographer Louis Farrer. And this to me is, I did a talk in the UK a couple years ago where they asked me to pick my 8 favorite photographs. This was my #1 favorite photograph. There's something about this man and his vulnerability so attractive to me. And so the more I photographed strangers, the more I found myself drawn to this sort of person. This is at a singles dance party. These kind of lonely men I was attracted to. So this is before the internet, and this is dating. Yeah, like this is when people really had to struggle to find a date. And then I found that, okay, now I'm able to photograph landscapes and people, and I kind of have a sense of my subject matter. And one thing led to another, and I started working again along the Mississippi River. But you can see how a picture like this is related to the previous slide that I showed. And this photograph, his name is Charles, is probably the best known picture I've ever made. And how did I find him? I was driving along the Mississippi River. I saw this house with this unusual building on top of it, this glass roof room on top of it. And I thought, surely someone interesting lives there. I knocked on the door, and I met his wife. She told me he wasn't home, but she told me her husband had moved the stairwell in their house several times. And I thought, well, this is an interesting character. I came back, and he took me through the home. And this is exactly the kind of person I was interested in, this sort of lonely dreamer type. And who also, with this theme of like starting again, being a beginner, I think he was living a life of always being a beginner. So I photographed him, and now this is the time at which the internet had started. And I was excited by the idea of web surfing, of one picture leading to another and to another. And so this photograph of the man with the airplanes leads to this photograph. How? This picture was Charles Lindbergh's boyhood bed. Charles Lindbergh had made the first transatlantic flight. So I was making these kind of connections beneath the surface of the photographs. This is not my favorite picture, but I like to show it because there's a mistake in it, essentially, that tablet on the table there. And what that is almost everyone I photographed, I would ask them to write down on a sheet of paper what their dream is. These look like this. Incidentally, his dream was, he said, I want to live to be 100 and look the way I do now. So I was photographing along the Mississippi River, but the Mississippi River wasn't the subject, and I rarely photographed the river itself. I was just using the idea of the river as a metaphor for this kind of wandering. As I was driving down the Mississippi, I was thinking a lot about a kind of boyish freedom. There's this fantasy about being Huckleberry Finn and going on a raft, which is kind of similar to being a young photographer and getting in a car and driving. And then I started thinking about the opposite of freedom and imprisonment. And because along the river, are many prisons. And in Huckleberry Finn, you have this character, Jim the slave, who's trying to find freedom by going up the river. And so I started photographing prisoners or visiting prisons. This is Angola State Prison, which is the largest maximum security prison in the country. Just show you detail here. So the prison is surrounded by the Mississippi on three sides, and it was a former slave plantation, in fact. And I mean, it's kind of fascinating because it's, you have African Americans, or virtually all of these workers, and then you have the white man on the horse, the white prison guard. So this, what she's holding here is a photograph of an angel. And it's a long story as to how I came to meet her and so forth, but I was really attracted to this photograph that she had in her living room, and to me it looked like one of Eggleston's sky pictures, and she thought this photograph was speaking to me. And it's kind of this interesting staring match where I wanted something from her and she wanted something from me. We're like locked eyes. When I was traveling the Mississippi, I didn't have the idea necessarily of photographing religion. I didn't go out consciously with that idea, but if you travel in the middle of America, you're just constantly bumping up against it. And the other thing is, I chose to travel in the springtime every time I went down the river. So it's in part because I wanted to sort of relive that time period when I photographed with my girlfriend in college. And so as I traveled in the springtime, then you have these, Palm Sunday and Ash Wednesday. And this picture is actually made on Easter in New Orleans. And the project, again, it's not a documentary of the Mississippi, and one way of telling people it's not is by the title, Sleeping by the Mississippi. And this repeating motif of beds and a suggestion of dreams and dreaming. Originally, it was called From Here to There, which is the title of this lecture, because it was this way of one picture leading to the next, and then it became Sleeping by the Mississippi, this maquette here, which incidentally has a typo. Mississippi is spelled wrong in that one. And then I self-published, I think 25 copies originally, because my dream was if I had to write down on a sheet of paper, what is my dream? It was to publish a photo book, but how was that ever gonna happen? I had no reputation. But inkjet technology was at a place where I could just make 25 of my own, so I did that. And then I got very lucky, and the right person saw it, and they showed someone else, and I got in the Whitney Biennial, and then all of a sudden I had a real published book. In the exhibition, you'll see photographs of Sleeping by the Mississippi that look kind of like this size. And in fact, I printed 3 different sizes of photographs for Sleeping by the Mississippi, so like small, medium, large. I didn't know what I was doing in the art world at that point. And I like to show this small size in the exhibition because it also points to my sort of naivete. I was sort of thinking, I'll just put a book on the wall. And I like to highlight that because I was and really am a book photographer first. That's how I think of work, because I can control this space of the book. And exhibitions have come later. And because probably like a lot of you can't just like hang an exhibition, a giant exhibition somewhere. So to learn how to do that, it takes a lot of time and it requires working with other people. After Sleeping by the Mississippi, it got quite a bit of attention, and suddenly I had a career, and I left my job, but there was a question, what are you going to do next? And there's actually quite a bit of pressure to do something quickly, and it was kind of a difficult process because I had really just found my voice as a photographer. And what I knew is that I wanted to work in more or less the same way of photographing people and landscapes and still lives, but I didn't want to photograph the same subject matter. And by that I don't mean the Mississippi River, I mean like dreams and wandering and such. And what was on my mind at that time was love and marriage and passion and those sorts of themes. So I decided to go to Niagara Falls, which, if you don't know, is a place where a lot of people, at least my grandparents' generation, used to go for honeymoons. And so I had this idea, and then I went there for the first time, and it's just a miserable little town. Actually, most of it's on the Canadian side of the border, and then there's an American side. And I started photographing couples like this, and the pictures were just sort of ho-hum, not really great. It wasn't really getting at this subject matter of love. And I had to face this issue of like, you know, how do you hear people's voices? How do you get at their passion? And out of desperation, I had this idea of collecting love letters. And so everyone that I would photograph and kind of everywhere I would go, I would ask people if they still had love letters. And so throughout the book are these letters, and they start, like this one is like every cliche ever written. And another thing I did is, instead of photographing newlywed couples, I realized, I can just photograph one person. And somehow it became more poignant. By photographing her without her new husband, it somehow became about the life to come in a way. So I started like getting at love and romance in different ways. And when I did photograph couples, I realized I needed to kind of energize the photograph. How can I do that? Because you have to understand that I'm using a large format camera. It's very slow. So I thought, what if I took nude portraits of couples? And so a picture like this, you know, it's a lot of work to get to this stage of making the picture. But it intensifies things. I really wanted to just like turn up the volume. I was thinking a lot about German typology when I made these photographs, and I had this term in my head of lyrical typology, so that I would have letters, nude portraits, and then one other element were these motels. And this motel architecture, again, it's very evocative of another time. And then in between, I would scatter different photographs. This says, if there was a nice apartment and I have a decent job and you felt happy and thought there could be a nice history together, would you come home? Unlike the Mississippi, I actually photographed the falls again and again. And so the book looks like this, and then I think my biggest struggle as a photographer is how much of the story am I going to tell? And in the back of Sleeping by the Mississippi, in small little text, are the stories behind some of the pictures. In Niagara, I did something more visual and had these notes behind the photographs. And it's something that's never been resolved in my work, because I think it's so much of the power of photography is creating your own story. But at the same time, I want to share these stories. So there's a battle. And an exhibition is really an opportunity to strip that story away and to have this kind of physical response to the work. So then you can see here, I think, a more sophisticated and elegant form of presenting the work. I like to think about photography now as analogous to musical distribution, so that you have like digital distribution where everything's free and flowing and on the radio or downloadable. And then you have vinyl, you have this album, and the photo book is like that. This thing it's expensive, but you can possess it and bring it home and spend time with it quietly. And then the exhibition is like the live show, it's the concert, and where you can really stand in front of a work and feel it. After Sleeping by the Mississippi and Niagara, then I had survived as an artist. And I got through 2 projects, and I could change my way of working. And I also, I was changing as a person. I was, and I kind of wanted to run away. I was kind of having, the classic midlife crisis, and I started thinking about this fantasy of running away. And I did a commission from the High Museum in Atlanta, and I could photograph anywhere in the South. And I was driving to a location where the Unabomber was. The Unabomber, no, sorry, it's not the Unabomber. It was the Olympic bomber who, when the Olympics were in Atlanta, he had done this bombing, and then he hid out in a forest for years, and the FBI knew he was in the forest, but they could never find him. And so I went looking for places where he had been hiding. And on the way, I visited this tiny little monastery. And I was thinking about what it meant to be a young man who's a monk who leaves society in that way, or someone like this fellow who, I don't know if you can see there, he's got a swastika tattoo on his arm. He's running away from society in another way. This is actually another monk. He was called the Nocturnal Hermit, and he lived deep, deep in the woods. And I started photographing in a different way at this point too. So I made his picture from very far away and then blew up this detail. And why was I doing that? At this time in my life, I was kind of fed up with photography. I think this was a result of the beginnings of social media and real oversaturation of photographs, and I was sort of sick of it. And so I didn't care about making great pictures. So I was making pictures like this of someone from far, far away. This was made from a window. It was actually made from this window, which you might recognize from the Robert Frank picture earlier. And this photograph, which I really think it's not a good picture at all, but what makes it is the story, which is this is where the Unabomber, the sort of most famous domestic terrorist in America, lived in rural Idaho. And this issue of the story behind the picture. So in the case of this work, I was making very fragmentary pictures where it's very hard to connect the story and to connect these images. But I knew that they were being connected for me in a way because I was being followed around by 2 European filmmakers who were kind of capturing the story for me. So in the book, Broken Manual, you see this picture and you know nothing about it. But if you see the movie about the making of this book, you get to meet the character who lives in this house. And I'm just going to show a little clip of him.
You want to hear my story?
Yeah, let's hear it.
From start to finish. This is a hard one, but I'm just gonna talk. If you wanna put me on tape on this one, this is the good one. That way if these bastards kill me. When I was 7 years old, my mother and father was methamphetamine cooks. Well, by the time I was 7, I was already learning to sleep with my clothes on and my boots so I'd be ready to run, because my mother and father would yank me out of the bed at any hour of the night and beat me half through the sheetrock and beat my arms and break my arms and legs. But by the time I was 7, I took off and I went down the street and I met this old man named Elvin Lester Boone. And yes, I believe in this old man almighty. He is the only person on the whole planet that ever cared about me.
And I'm really fascinated by what the medium of photography can and cannot do. So it can't do what those filmmakers were able to do. And I would often express to them jealousy, like, wow, you can hear his voice, you can hear all of that pain. And they were really jealous of me as well, because I could work in this much more cryptic and poetic sort of way. And part of my kind of ongoing process, and part of the reason I feel like the need to reinvent myself, is that so I can grapple with this medium and its limitations, which are substantial. As I said, I was frustrated with photography while making this work. And in fact, for a period of time, I was much more interested in the idea of buying a cave than I was in photographing. So this was actually my dream cave. This was somewhere in Utah. And at a certain point, I was actually like meeting with realtors, but I could never find it. So I had a friend of mine build this model of the dream, because I wanted a tree house on top, because you don't really want to sleep in the cave. And then the book looks like this. It came inside of another book, so you could hide it while you were preparing to run away. It's designed as a manual, as a guidebook on running away from society. It's broken because it doesn't work. You can't run away. All of these people, these recluses, I found them in part because they wanted to be found. And no one really runs away. You have to engage with society in one way or another. For the exhibition of this work, it turned much more into an installation. And this is when I was getting more and more sophisticated and creating the experience of seeing the work in person. Now, after I was done with this project, I was kind of fed up with this individualism and this desire to run away. And so I wanted to kind of start playing and start engaging with other people and with society and whatnot. And it was around this time that I created this thing called Little Brown Mushroom. And Little Brown Mushroom is whatever I want it to be, essentially. It's this like pretend business. But it's always collaborative, and I'm always playing with other people. And one of the things that we did was we had a summer camp for socially awkward storytellers, because I think of photographers as people that kind of want to stand in front of a crowd like I am right now, but are way too awkward to do it. So, as you can see. And I started thinking of the slideshow as an interesting format for photography. So each of the students had to create a fine art slideshow that told a story, and they eventually told these stories in front of an audience. And that guy in the lower right, his name is Brad Zeller. He's a writer, and he became a regular collaborator with Little Brown Mushroom. And then he and I went on to do this project, I'm not going to show it to you now, called the LBM Dispatch, which are all these newspapers made in 7 different states around the US. And each state we would go to, we would collaborate with young students who would help us as drivers and assistants. And like in this case, that picture in the lower right was done in collaboration with a university in Michigan. And we did a pop-up show. And it was this process of being in the world and engaging with it and being collaborative. And then one of the last big projects with Little Brown Mushroom was this Winnebago workshop. And this was this art school, this traveling art school, and for teenagers. And we did a number of short trips, and then we eventually did a cross-country trip from where I live in Minnesota to New York. And along the way, different artists would join us. We would do lectures inside the RV and so forth. It was kind of an amazing experience. So photography for me is also this way of dealing with other people, of engaging with other people as this kind of socially awkward human being, which leads me to like my big theory of photography. So now is when you take out your notepad. And this is it, right here. So what you have, these 2 dots. So the photographer and the subject. And this is really how I think of portraiture and photography as a whole. And I'll use this picture to talk about it. So this guy, I told you the story about how I found him. But if you saw this picture, you would never know how I found him. And like, what do you know about him? Do you know where he grew up? Do you know how many siblings he had? Do you know what his dream was in life? Do you know what I had him write down on a sheet of paper, what he said? No, you don't know any of that. What you see, it's like, you can look at this exterior, you can see paint on him, you can see his beard, you can see dirt on his nose. And from all these details, you create some sort of very hazy picture of who he is. But it's not that much information. And one thing that I started thinking about, though, is that, so here at the bottom of the picture, and photographers can take comfort in this, you see how his feet are out of focus? So like that's an accident. But see how this ground in front of him is in focus? I look at that and I think, okay, so one of the things that I'm photographing here, if I go back, is not just the exterior, is not just his whiskers and his clothes, but I'm actually photographing space. I am photographing that space between myself and the subject. And for me, this feeling of space is as important as the actual human being on the other end of it. So if I'm photographing this picture, it's a lot of space. If I'm photographing this one, it's less space, but there's always this distance. And I've had this concept for a really long time, that photography was a way of communicating, in some ways, my separation from the world. And I had an exhibition in Helsinki, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, I can't remember. And I flew to Helsinki, I landed, I was super jet lagged, but I went for this long walk. And I was meditating one day, and what happened is this. Like, everything collapsed. And I had, like a spiritual epiphany or something. And, some of you might have experienced this. some people experience it on hallucinogens or what have you. And I have no doubt that it was related to jet lag or whatever it was. But I really felt like, oh my God, this sounds so corny, but it was like, there is no separation. Like, everything is connected. And I know that sounds, goofy. But I walked back to my hotel and I was like, every person I saw, I was like, I love that person. and I felt like totally connected to them. And I actually still believe this, that separation is really just a cognitive process because there's there's energy moving all over the place, but whatever. I had this experience, and of course you can't stay in that space, right? But it was super profound. And I thought, well, this changes everything because my photography has always been about separation. And now I know that things aren't separate. What am I going to do? And I wasn't sure. And so I regularly do assignment photography, and I didn't really want to do that anymore. But the New York Times called me and they said, we have an assignment. You can travel anywhere in the world for a travel issue. Is there somewhere you want to go? And I was like, well, it's hard to turn down an assignment like that. And so I said, I want to go to yoga. I want to go to, India and study laughter yoga. And because I was also upset that all my pictures were always sad looking and full of distance. So I wanted to learn how to make happy pictures. And so I did this workshop and I became a certified laughter yoga instructor. And I would go out into Bangalore, India, and I would laugh with people and make their portraits. And this got published. And the truth is the pictures weren't very good. So I was like, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't be doing photography anymore. Maybe photography is just kind of promoting distance in some ways. And so this is like an epic tale, but I have this abandoned farmhouse, and I started going out there, and I was like, I was in a really elevated state of mind. I would watch the light move around the room and be like, like everything's changing, it's beautiful. And I started making these sculptures again, like I did when I was a teenager, and just playing around out there. And it was a fun year. But what happened is, these dots started spreading further and further apart as time goes by, right? And then I made an adjustment to my theory of photography, which is that I wasn't just photographing space, I was photographing energy, right? Because what is a photograph? It's light bouncing off one surface and then coming into the lens. And so I'm photographing space and energy. And I started developing this analogy. Sorry, this is the weird part of the lecture. And if you go to the exhibition, you won't see any of this. Don't worry. But you saw me on what's the word for seesaw in? Yeah, okay, that. So I had this theory that photography is like this, that portraiture, like a seesaw, it's space, but it's also energy. It's this movement of energy. And wow, I should have taken this out of the lecture. I'm sorry. We're almost done. But I collaborated then with a sculptor who he built a seesaw for me and these different objects. And I did this event at a gallery. And what it was we would invite one person. I wouldn't choose who they were. And they would come into the gallery space with me, no audience, and we were alone, and we wouldn't speak to each other. and it was for 90 minutes, and we would play. And so like this is one example. So sometimes people would bring, like this woman brought a camera, and so we never talked. We played on the seesaw. Sometimes we would paint and draw and do whatever. And it was really an incredible thing. And it was really, there was a purity to this exchange, a real balance to it. But the problem is, it's something I can't really share with you. There was no way to document this in a meaningful way. But I did have this one, so this encounter, to this day, I've never talked to this woman. I know, I've learned that she's a dancer. I later learned this, but we had this an amazing 90 minutes where she did this thing where I would click the shutter and she would tap her heart like this. And we started like doing this in rhythm, and it was really amazing. Wow, okay. And then what happened is the person, I was working with a choreographer who was helping to choose different people to have these sessions with me. And one of the people he wanted to choose was this older, famous choreographer. Her name's Anna Halprin. And it turned out she was too frail to come. And he said, well, maybe you could go visit her. And so I went out to her home, and I spent time with her. Now, in this case, we weren't on a seesaw, even though, interestingly, this thing kind of looks like a seesaw. And we talked to each other, and it was more like a conventional photographic portrait. And in fact, there's a lot of distance here, because I'm actually, at this point, I'm outside of her house looking through. And yet, in the state of mind that I was in at this point, I'm like, well, it's distance, it's space, but it's also energy. And this is, of course, the realm of what dancers deal with. They deal with bodies in space. And I had this new view of portraiture that was just slightly freshened up. And I thought, you know what, this is all I want to do now. I just want to make portraits with people. I just want to have an experience in space with them. And it's not like I want those dots to be overlapping. I just want whatever happens to happen in a given exchange. And so I started meeting with different people. This is Hanya Yanagihara. She's an author. I had never met her before, but I got introduced, and I went to her apartment in New York. And I could tell that she was uncomfortable with the camera close to her, so I kept going further and further and further away. And I was kind of crouched down, but at the same time we were having a very intimate conversation. And so I let there be distance. This picture was of a dancer in Berlin, and I didn't want location to matter. I didn't want to do a project about America or Donald Trump or anything like that. I just wanted to be with a human being. And I liked working with dancers because they understood space. I was invited to Ukraine, and what would happen would be, the people who invited me, I'd say, hey, can you find someone who seems interesting, who I could spend time with? And it was as simple as that. Sometimes I allowed myself to just photograph the space itself, and all the pictures were made indoors, but the outdoors, I wanted to be present, and I wanted there to be light. I was very inspired by this book, Mirrors and Windows, by John Sarkowski. And this is curator of the Museum of Modern Art, and he divided photographers into these two groups, mirror photographers and window photographers. And what I was kind of coming to terms with is an acceptance of this duality, that that a window is a mirror, if that makes sense. Most of the people I didn't know at all. This gentleman is Vince Aletti. He's a photography critic. I knew him a little bit. And that picture on the wall behind him is taken by Peter Hujar, who was really like this angel of photography hovering over this project. Hujar made a lot of portraits in interior spaces, but with such incredible intimacy. And in fact, so that man was Vince Aletti's lover back in the day. This is a picture of Peter Hujar. And so photographers came into this project a little bit. I was given an assignment to photograph Nan Golden, and I made a portrait of her, but the picture I really loved this is Nan Golden's bed, and with these two Peter Hujar pictures above the bed. This was one of my favorite encounters. This photographer, her name is Nancy Rexroth. She's not as well known, particularly in Europe. She did a book called Iowa. Actually, all the pictures were made in Ohio, but the book's called Iowa. And she's a very shy woman, very reserved, and it was such a tender experience with her, and I am very close, and I felt a real connection to her. This is her work, a self-portrait of hers, and she would often work in these interior spaces. I'm just going to leave it at that. That's an installation view. That's the book. That's my talk. We can now have questions. If there are questions. Thank you. So we have microphone runners, and I don't know, I talked for longer than I was supposed to, so we'll see how this goes. But here's one here, if we can get a microphone there.
First, thank you. And the question is, you didn't mention Magnum at all. What role does it play?
Yeah, so, it's funny. So a couple months ago, I was invited to this conference in Arizona, and they invited me to talk about community in photography. And I thought, wow, I'm a strange person to invite because I tend to be a bit reclusive. But then I started thinking about it, and I was like, well, wait a second. I have Little Brown Mushroom. I collaborate with a lot of people. And then I'm a member of Magnum Photos, which is this community of photographers. So Magnum is a cooperative of photographers. And why did I join Magnum? I mean, as you can see from my early development, I came from the fine art side of things. So I was not like dreaming of being a war correspondent or what have you. But what happened is after Sleeping by the Mississippi came out, I was suddenly in the art world, but I was very suspicious of it. I thought, well, I can't sustain this forever. It's clearly based on fashion and so forth. And also, I didn't have an advanced photography degree, so I couldn't really go into professional teaching. So I thought I better have a backup plan. So I started doing magazine photography. And then someone said, hey, you should think about applying to Magnum. I was like, Magnum? It's like, that's just like, that's war photography and stuff like that, right? And then I didn't realize like what it was. And I applied, and eventually, I became a nominee. It's this long, arcane process for getting in. But what I realized it was is a community of photographers. And all over the world. And we would get together at different points. And so it has largely functioned that way. It also plays an economic role and was instrumental, for example, in the touring of this exhibition. But Magnum is a lot, yes, it's a complicated thing, but it's in my life, yeah. It's, I always say that it's like it's like a big family, and we have a family reunion, and you have the uncle you can't stand, and you have the brother that you love, and and you come together, and they're always in my life. It's beautiful that way. Yeah. Okay. Next question. What's that? Oh, who are the brothers? No, honestly, there's many of them over the years. And so the thing about Magnum is that it is this ordeal to get in. So you apply, you spend 2 years, they vote on you. You spend just to get to the next level, another 2 years, they vote on you, and it's really rigorous. And once you're in, you're in. But you very much bond with those people that you come in with, and so they are like Jim Goldberg, whatever, Alessandro Sanguinetti, Olivia Arthur. There's so many of them. Yeah. There was a question back here.
Hi. I wanted to ask, because you mentioned you do large format photography. Did you ever do also 35 millimeters or digital? And how do you find working with medium format or large format photography? Because it's more planned and heavy and thoughtful, maybe, and less spontaneous.
I don't think thoughtful, but yes. So if you see the exhibition, you will see a couple of projects. So that early work was all medium format, flash. Songbook, which is that work from those newspapers. That's all digital photography. So the thing about photography as a medium is that it's always connected to technology, right? So writers aren't connected to what typewriter they use or what have you. But this medium is, and so it's a natural question, and if I were in the audience, I would want to know all about what cameras I used and all of that. That said, I've never wanted that to be the defining factor of my photography. So it kind of became that because I use this large format camera a lot. And the reason I love large format photography, and I've always said this, is the way it renders space. And when I talked about the space between myself and the subject, it carves out space. And that when you stand in front of a big print, you can feel the space. So that's what I love about it. What I hate about it is that if anyone moves, it's fucked. And I miss out on all these moving things that happen in life. So thus I do projects with flash and digital and so forth. Yeah. There's a question here. Maybe we should wait for the microphone. Yes.
Hi, Alec. Thank you for being here. I was wondering about sequencing. I really love your sequencing, and as a photographer, I'm interested if there is some methodic in your approach to how you start to sequence your photographs in a project.
Yeah, so I mean, this is one of those things about the medium of photography that's interesting and fascinating, is that when I talked about free digital downloads and stuff, of course, most of my pictures are seen entirely independent of any sequence. They just it's on, there's the woman with the blue bathing cap is suddenly all over Vienna without any context. And the one place I can control the sequence is the book. And then an exhibition is totally different. And it's because that's more about this encounter with the individual photograph. So The one place where I think heavily about sequence is in the book. The thing about book sequencing is that it's not like a novel. It's not like beginning, middle, and end. And it's much more to me like poetry. And it's much more about this shift of feeling. And it is the way I do it is by feeling. This is why it's so hard to teach or to talk about. And it's this process, and for me, it's a process of making maquettes, and like the turning of the page, the physical act of doing that is so essential to sequencing. So I can't answer essentially, but every time I think I have an answer, it's not that. Yeah.
Is it possible, just one more question?
Sure.
I was wondering about approaching people. You already spoke about that, but as we see, you succeed to get such a intimate relationship, and as I saw in your movies, like documentary of your work, that sometimes just one day maybe or something like that. And I was wondering how you succeed to get such a connection and to get people involved, like to be naked or something like that, and what they think about that, why they agreed to do such a work. Mm-hmm. And do you ask yourself later about the ethic in those kind of pictures? Is that okay? Because we know such a later if someone.
Yeah.
Sorry for my.
No, that's like 5 questions right there. Yeah. So my way of working is almost always been. It's a shorter period of time actually. So it's anywhere from 5 minutes to like 5 hours, but it's never 5 days or 5 weeks. It's this brief but intense encounter. But you know, they're different. I really admire different ways of working, people who just take snapshots on the street, or those people that live with others or what have you. It's just the way I'm comfortable working. In terms of like, how do I do it? My philosophy is to be honest and to say what it is I'm doing, which was really hard when I was starting. When I was really starting, you could say you're a student. That's the greatest excuse. And then it's really hard when you're not a student, but you're not working for a publication, or it's hard. So the thing about Seen by the Mississippi is I could say I'm driving along the Mississippi. This is what I'm doing. But at that time, I didn't know that a picture I made might be on a billboard, right? So the ethics really change once the pictures really start going out into the world. And I would try to be honest with people, but most people don't have the context to understand what that means. And this did bother me, and it bothered me more and more as time went by. And in fact, during that period where I stopped photographing people, interesting. It was the same period of time I stopped eating meat, and I was just like, you know what? I don't need to do this. I don't need to exploit animals, and I'm not going to exploit people. But now I'm eating meat and photographing people again. So I'm sorry. And basically, it's something that bothers me, but it's not the biggest crime in the world. That's all I can say. And you give me the when it's time. Okay, back here. Yeah.
Hello. I have a follow-up question. When you are photographing human beings, you are offered them payment?
I'm sorry, say again. Do I offer people money?
When you are photographing human beings or people, you are offered them payment?
No. I mean, normally no. So what I've always done is I offer them a photograph. So in those early days when I was taking the pictures in the park and stuff, I would sometimes say I'm going to send a person a picture, and I didn't do it sometimes. And I had a lot of guilt about that. So when I started Sleeping by the Mississippi, then I was like very ethically good, and I always sent them. And that's been the policy going forward. And every once in a while, I would, if a person really wanted money for whatever reason, I had no ethical problem giving money. But I don't want, if you base it on a monetary exchange, then it turns into something else. Because what I'm looking for is intimacy, and money sort of throws that whole dynamic off. Because I do, editorial work and so forth, and it's my problem with photographing models is that it's a commercial exchange, and it's a different language. So, one last question.
Hello. So, as we saw with your last project, you went to this house and then started like building things and sculptures. Do you have inspiration from outside of photography, or when you stopped photographing people, as you said, did you feel that you would also like could take it a route where photography like didn't matter so much, that you would like do installation or sculptural work from that point on, or is that in your interest?
No, absolutely. And this is the thing about becoming a beginner again and again, is finding those inspirations out of photography and leaving photography behind for periods of time so that I can fall in love with it again. And doing these little experiments. So I showed that seesaw experiment. A few years ago, I created this podcast, which I never released. But it was meant to be listened to while you fall asleep. And I'm actually going to release one episode of it because I have a new project right now that's a newsletter. Actually, this is nice. You're letting me, let me get out of this 1 second. Oh, I don't even know how to, there we go. So if you go to littlebrownmushroom.com, we lost this window. Sorry, you can't see it. I don't know what happened. Doesn't matter. Littlebrownmushroom.com. There's no money involved. But I realized I was getting really sick of Instagram, no offense, and just like these little bits of information constantly coming at us. And so I realized, I can create an email newsletter that's like a blog that I used to have years ago. And I'm collaborating with another writer. Her name's Rebecca Bengal. And they have different themes. And the theme for this Friday's edition is sleep and dreams. And I'm also released that podcast there. And so this is all to say that it's super important. And if you're a photographer, it's super important to derive inspiration outside of the medium, for sure. Thank you. I'm going to go sign books.